Welcome everyone to the webinar. We have our next topic that has been asked on several occasions in prior webinars and is related to the topic of ethics and privacy in a modern age. And of course, we have all sorts of 3-letter and 2-letter acronyms there, AI, ML, ONA, etc. And there's no better person than John Sumser to demystify what that is, as well as the impact from ethics and privacy perspective that they bring. So I'd like to welcome two of my co-hosts and panelists today. John Sumser, who is HR examiner. So he's, in case you haven't browsed his website, I would strongly encourage you. You'll find a lot of interesting content and information around the topics of analytics, topics of AI, and impact from HR perspective. And my usual co-host, Anthony Evelibanda with Trustsphere. And we are going to have a very interesting conversation with John on the topics of ethics and privacy. So before we start, John, would you like to introduce yourself and how you came to do what you do?
Well, I'll give you the quick, crazy tour. My name's John Sumser, and I run a company called HR Examiner. You should take a look at it. We do a couple of weekly radio shows, and there's content at the edges of HR and HR technology. I got out of undergraduate school with a philosophy degree, and at the time there was a skills surplus, something that we're liable to see again one of these days, but there was a skills surplus, and engineers were pumping gas and philosophy majors weren't working. And so I ended up going to work as an engineer and became a great engineer. I spent almost 20 years in the very early days of processor development, signal to noise assessment, and display design. And then came to California to start a company that looked at the evolution of technology in HR. And I've been doing that for about 25 years. It means that I've seen a lot of things and have some pretty interesting ideas about how the pieces go together. So that's me. It's nice to be introduced to those of you who don't know me.
Thrilled to have you. So you've been studying the space of analytics, you've been studying the space of AI, data, and all sorts of techniques to make sense of human beings and even predict people behavior. What are the things that you are concerned or thrilled and excite you about that space?
So what you should know about me is that I tend to look at things as an engineer. So I don't see irresolvable problems, but what engineers do is they identify problems so that they can solve them, right? And so often what I'm excited about is the stuff that's problematic, right? If it looks like it's going along fine, it's not really an engineering problem anymore. So the things that excite me are the very edges of analytics and the stuff that's generally classed as artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of hope and promise there that I think unfolds into a world beyond our current imagining. And I have yet to actually talk to anybody or hear of anybody who's able to imagine what I think is coming. And what I think is coming is a world in which people work because they enjoy working. And that idea has not been available to us because we've had all of these sort of industrial tools. And so what's happening with the introduction of analytics and intelligence into the technical tools in HR is we are at the spearhead of an advance in the quality of workers' lives and the quality of the output of the work that's astonishing. So I tend to think hard about where the limits are. And so have you got that fruit bowl picture, Don?
Fruit bowl is up.
The fruit bowl is up. I wonder, oh, there it is. Oh, if you're not used to Zoom, sometimes the image comes on the other page. So this is my favorite fruit salad, and it is a delightful thing to have and hold. The thing that I like best is how all of the flavors go together. So show me the next slide, Don, if you don't mind. This is how a machine sees a fruit salad, right? And if you were to go back to the first one of the things that you'd notice is that right before the whipped cream in the pile are the dots, right? Because this is about counting things. And so my first real concern about the world that we're entering is we don't always know what we're counting. And sometimes we count stupid things. And so in this case, the count is of the polka dots on the bowl. You could show correlation between all of these things that have been counted and draw all sorts of interesting conclusions about the relationship between these things that you've counted. But they never, ever actually get to the point where they tell you about what's at the bottom of the fruit bowl. And so what's at the bottom of the fruit bowl is that's the place where all of the interactions turn into juice. And you can't, with any way that we have access to right now, take the kinds of things that we're measuring and actually accurately describe the reality that we're measuring, right? What you get instead is a kind of a map, and it's generally useful, but it's subject to judgment error that's pretty crazy because if you wanted to revise this recipe, you certainly wouldn't revise the number of dots. But it's not always easy to see that the constituent elements don't all go together the way that it looks like when you do a perfectly quantitative view of the stuff. Much of what's out in the world right now counts things. And what's exciting, you know, as the Internet of Things comes our way and the volume of counting that we can do goes through the ceiling, we're going to get closer and closer and closer to being able to approximate what's in that juice at the bottom of the bowl. But we'll never, ever be able to get all the way there because the second thing that interests me is that there's a latency problem. It's not unique to intelligence and analytics, but it is an important thing to understand, and that is you count stuff, then you analyze stuff, then you recommend stuff, and then you decide stuff. And each one of those steps takes time. And that distance between the event itself and the decision that you make about the event itself causes error in decision-making over and over and over again. Humans are really good at accounting for this. Machines don't have the capacity to count for the lag after the counting and the processing is done because they're not really involved in that part of the process. There are not tools yet that make machines good at doing those things. So you end up with a universe of analytic tools that offer an approximation, but they're largely limited in their scope. They're never advertised that way. And that gets me to the third thing that has me interested and exciting, and that's the potential for changes in the way we design interfaces. Currently, interfaces are all about arriving at clarity. The whole point of an interface is that when you look at the output of the machine, you know exactly what to do when you see it. That's what they mean by an intuitive interface, fundamentally. The problem is the output of analytics processes and intelligent processes are not complete answers. And so what you don't want people to do with that information is make a decision on the face of it right away. What you want to encourage is conversation and fuzziness around the output rather than clarity at the output stage. So those are the three things, and they run from time to time into the question of software reliability, which we may or may not get into in this conversation. So how's that?
That's fabulous. And it sounds like some people have a tough time hearing me. Is this okay? I'm going to get the mic closer. So you were talking about the complexities when it comes to raw analytics and all sorts of other techniques and applying it to the data. And I think when it comes to the data in HR, it's even more complex because we are talking about human beings. So behind every number that we analyze, there is a career, there is a set of dreams, there is a livelihood. So it's even more important to apply that fuzziness and interface design to whatever we produce. So for us as analytics practitioners, from your perspective, what advice would you give to consider when we build our stories that get presented to the HR leadership or business leaders to make decisions?
So yesterday I happened to be in a conversation with two people who I think are the smartest data scientists in the academic and commercial realms of assessment. And after our conversation moved on for a while, I ended up asking them whether they thought that in their work they would discover a variable that was unknown to them currently and that would change the way they thought about what assessment meant over the course of the next 5 years. And they both kind of at the same moment looked at me and said, yeah, we're really looking forward to that. And so at the research end of the framework development processes for a significant subset of analytics, there's a clarity about the fact that we don't understand people at all, and that it's possible to discover a way of seeing them that hasn't been charted before, because of the onslaught of data and because of the assistance we're going to get with machines.
Brilliant. Yes, and the sheer assumption that we can understand a human being, it's quite presumptuous of us to assume that the data will be able to reveal the beauty and the complexity of.
Well, and more than that, I don't think we understand organizations at all, right? And so an organization, it'd be nice if it conformed in ways that allowed us to run analytics on it easily. But what it does is it grows, it develops routines, something causes it to grow again, it develops routines. And so organizations operate more like a plant that blossoms on some sort of routine basis than they operate like adherence to quarterly result dictates. And what we don't know as we try to use analytics to manage organizations is what the unintentional consequences of the measurement are going to be. That's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, and we'll make some mistakes.
And speaking of mistakes and unintended consequences, possibly, in light of the recent news and media attention to how the data was misused, do you have a point of view, or do you think the regulations such as GDPR will be able to prevent some of it or alleviate? And then do you also foresee that that type of regulation will start being adopted more and more outside the European Union?
I think this will probably be controversial. I think we're way too early to regulate. We're way too early to regulate. What we've got right now is a very interesting turn in human affairs where I don't believe anything that I read. You don't believe anything that you read. We've recently seen video. I think everybody who's listened to this has seen the Barack Obama fake video. And so we can't believe what we see. We can't believe the people around us because they can't believe what they read either. And so there's a generic trust problem at the foundation of the culture that is just now being understood. And that generic trust problem isn't going to resolve with control. You can't control this. You cannot approach this as a command and control problem, or you'll make it worse, right? What this kind of uncertainty looks for is authority. But authority always amplifies the problem when you apply it to this kind of chaos, right? That rigid frameworks are not useful right now. This is an incubation stage that we're in, and it's going to be scary, and some weird stuff is going to happen. But the temptation to give into fear and inhibit the development of this thing is something that I hope we can figure out how to avoid.
Hope so too, and I hope there are sufficient principles and moral values that people can abide by without necessarily having a legislation put in place.
Yeah, it's frightening. And that requires a lot of trust to believe that right now. It requires a lot of trust to believe that right now. And I think it maybe even shows how white and male I am. Right? Right.
Yeah.
This may be a first-class example of privilege. I don't know. I'm certainly open to being told that.
No, I
So
tend to
speaking of
agree with that.
trust, yeah. Go on, Anthony.
No, I said I tend to agree with John in terms of like, there's going to be a lot of soul searching needed. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we have as practitioner for instilling into people who don't deal with that data manipulation, data analysis on a regular basis, a sense that we do it in an ethical way. And we're not using it to try and do nefarious activities, but just more, we're using it to improve, i.e. an organization or people or so forth. And with regards to the way we look at it, I go back to some of the work that we do in our organization, Atmosphere. It's always with a sense of democratization of the data so that there is transparency, so that everybody more or less understands why we're doing things and how we're doing it. And it doesn't solve all of the problems, but it at least gives a roadmap as to how we think of using your data and why we're going down that road. So it allows you to find some ways of challenging us if you believe that the way we're using the data is not appropriate.
That requires a kind of leadership that is more vulnerable than the contemporary high potential leadership model where some shining star becomes the center of everything and knows what's best for everybody. And instead, you have to be open to the wisdom of the entire ecosystem so that when the prevailing policy is challenged, that challenge is embraced rather than rejected.
Yeah.
And interestingly, we have a question from Roy Altman. Isn't there a strong possibility that advanced technology can lead to a dystopian future? Do you have a point of view on that?
Well, I think that's what Luddites have been saying for, I don't know, 250 years now? And, the changes that are wrought by big advances in technology are not easy. They're not easy. This next change in technology is going to ask us to step up our game another whole notch. And that might take a generation to get right. It might take 2 generations to get it right. But this is a universe in which it's possible to know ourselves better than we've ever known ourselves before, and that is a generally terrifying prospect. And so in the avoidance of that terror, you get the dystopian potential. But we've made it so far.
Yes, I just remember a conversation I had with my son who said, "Mom, have you read the 1984?" And I said, "I actually lived it." So to me, there's always the darker side of data use and how it may be misused by beyond our knowledge and our comprehension. And only, as you said, over generation, it may come through the negative impact or unforeseen impact that it may have.
Yeah. And there was one point which I think John kind of like alluded to is that nowadays with advancement in technology and the different media that we have, there is a sense that your data is not just living in a vacuum. So your data is interconnected with lots of other sources. And that's what brings a lot of, I would say, skepticism and concern for people. And when I try to bring it back to some of the work that we do in organizations, we try to minimize our utilization of data to the corporate footprint. And this is not a safe hold, but what it does, it allows us to ring fence the information that we analyze and gives you a sense of a greater control as to the hypothesis and conclusion that we might infer by looking at your data. So that's one of the big things that we try to do whenever we work with people with regards to data and data privacy. It's the sense of we're not looking at your Gmail, we're not looking at your Pinterest or Instagram. We try to focus on the digital footprint, which is corporate. And by using this, we try to look at patterns of exchange, communication, behaviors that could, if properly analyzed, help the organization move forward in a positive way.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that you limit your exploration and categorization to the boundaries of the ecosystem, and that in adhering to an ecosystem boundary, you gain all of the privacy benefits that accrue from that boundary. Is that fair?
That's a very fair summary. Because if we go beyond that, we're opening a Pandora's box.
So,
Man, I'm afraid it's open, but and I'm not sure that what's in there is bad, by the way.
that's true.
It's certainly scary.
Anthony, but just to paraphrase a little the question that David Friedman asked in Q&A. So even though the data is isolated only to the organizational network, you still can see a very eager and excited leader who says, oh, I'm going to look at this data and I'll see who may not be interacting as much with the rest of the network, and maybe make a decision that that person doesn't belong in our organization. So there may be some of the negative decisions or certain leadership decisions that are being made as a result of using that data that may negatively impact people.
Yeah, I think in any form of analysis, you always have the possibility of what I call wrong use of the data or outliers. Yeah. The thing that we tend to do at TrustSphere when we work with people, we want them to come to us with some questions that they would like answered. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you go down what I call a rabbit hole of analytics. And if people are not trained to analyze information, they might misinterpret what they're seeing. And as you said, they might make some, as John said before, they might make some rash decision without questioning what they're looking at. So from just try to answer the question is, you might have people looking at what you give them, and if you don't guide them thoroughly, they have the potential of misusing and misinterpreting what you're trying to show. And so that's why we try to do what I call a kind of like a hand-holding process. Whenever we create the analysis, we then spend time with the individuals and try and explain the things that we're seeing. But we will say, this is not the answer for everything. You have to put it in conjunction with, let's say, your performance review. Let's say, for example, your training processes. If you look at ONA in isolation, you're going to get what I call a truncated view of what might happen in your organization. Because let's say Anthony speaks to everybody, and you might be thinking, oh, it's really important for Anthony to speak to everyone, so we need to put him in a position where he has a greater influence in interacting with individuals. But guess what? Anthony normally works in R&D, so in R&D, you don't need to speak to the whole of the world. You need to focus on developing a program, and this is what really is valuable for us as an R&D developer. So if you don't really have those contextual data, you might think, oh, Anthony's a great person because he speaks to everyone. But in reality, when you look at the contextual data given to you, you realize that maybe it's not such a great thing. So there is that need for teaching people once the results have been produced.
So in essence, what you're saying is the responsibility of both solution providers, so whoever, like a TrustSphere company, whoever does the analysis, to ensure the right type of rigor is put around formulating those questions, and then being kind of the watchdog and saying, hey, this is not for this type of decisions, or you cannot get down to that level of granularity because you will cross certain regulatory or legal boundaries. And the second is also the practitioners, so the people who in organizations are using these tools to structure and build the stories for the leaders, and be the watchdog, protect the innocent, so to speak.
Yeah, you have to, exactly. You need to have that partnership. It's if it's only one side of the fence that moves in one direction, you're going to have disconnect and you're going to have big problems.
So I'd say that the interface has to be a conversation, right? The interface can't be a report. The interface cannot be a recommendation on a screen. The interface has to be the beginnings of a dialogue, because any analytical process has a latency gap. And you have to close the latency gap, and the analyst has to come to the party knowing there's a latency gap, and the decision maker has to come to the process knowing that there's a latency gap. And what you do in that conversation is try to close the gap between what the data says and what reality actually is. And until that gets articulated well, that both people, both sides of the contract come to the conversation with imperfect knowledge, and it's a discovery process in that conversation to get to a decision, then you're going to have people treating this stuff like it's a magic 8-ball. And it's not a magic 8-ball. It's a way to gain insight.
Yes. Jean is asking, Anthony, how transparent are your companies in using your solution with their employees on the data mining they do?
I always say, and John mentioned it, you need to have enlightened leadership. So I think a lot of the transparency really depends on the organization itself. You have some people that are very, very transparent because they say, we're doing this to improve our employees, to improve our organization, so we're going to be very clear as to what we're looking at and what we're trying to achieve. Then you have other organizations where they feel, in terms of the maturity of the employees, that maybe we need to analyze things further before we kind of like fully disclose what we're looking at. So in short, at TrustSphere, we're pretty transparent on everything that we do. But the ultimate decider is within the organization. We always encourage organizations to be transparent from the get-go, because this is when you get engagement and adoption from people. If you're not doing that, then this is where people believe that there is Big Brother and what you're doing is not really good for me, but for others. So to answer the question is, we're always transparent, but we really rely on the collaboration between ourselves and the clients who have responsibility of sharing this information within the firm to have the same message across. So that's the best answer I can give with regards to that.
So it's the trust is in your name, TrustSphere. You're trying to
promote
that as well.
Yeah, for us, and like one of the funny thing is, our CEO for a long time was the co-founder and president of the Online Trust Alliance, which really advocates transparency with regards to use of online information. So this is a big thing for us. We can't operate without that as part of our fabric. That's the big thing from TrustSphere perspective.
Makes sense. So we are at the end of our time. It flew by very quickly. I want to thank both of you for providing your insights, and I would like to encourage everyone to just shoot us a note or contact directly John and Anthony or myself about anything or any other questions that we may not have covered today.
Let me make one last comment here. One of the things I really liked about this conversation is this was a conversation about ethics. I hope you noticed that we didn't talk about rules, and we didn't talk about who's good and who's bad. We talked about the fundamental intent of the work, and that's what an ethics conversation is actually about.